Ever wonder if our sense of right and wrong is nothing more than a survival hack? What if everything we believe about good and evil, our deepest fears, our capacity for cruelty, that relentless feeling of never being enough, all of that is a byproduct of brutal evolutionary battles, prehistoric power struggles, and centuries of dogmatic influence? Today, we're cutting through the sugarcoating to expose Nietzsche's daring insights from On the Genealogy of Morals, showing how ancient instincts forged our modern moral code. Buckle up! So Friedrich Nietzsche wasn't one to accept moral values on faith. He challenged us to ask the hard questions. What's the true worth of the moral values given to us? Why do we build our society around them without ever questioning their origins or intrinsic meaning? Where did our modern Western values even come from, and how did they arise in the first place? For example, it's fascinating to look at how the word good was historically used in English. The word pairs were often good and bad or good and evil, rarely framed as kind and evil. No, it was good and evil, good and bad. So from the linguistic perspective, good was used to express both a functional positive characteristic, for example, something of good quality, and a moral positive one, for example, virtuous, kind-hearted. And in most philosophical texts, the same word good was used to capture both nuances, moral worth and quality, or something like pleasure. So in his essays, Nietzsche argues, let's take a closer look at what English moralists have to say about the origin of the word good or kind and its meaning. And many of them claim that someone was considered good or kind because they performed good deeds for others or provided them with some benefit. And in return for this act of kindness, these others would call the person good. And over time, say the English moralists, the original context where a specific act of service or kindness led to someone being called good was forgotten, and the term began to extend its meaning. It no longer referred only to someone who did good directly for me, but to anyone who did something good for someone. So instead of meaning good for me through direct service, it came to label any beneficial act universally as good. This evolution highlights how moral language can expand beyond its original concrete context, a dynamic that remains relevant in how we assign moral labels even today. For example, we might see a young man helping an elderly woman cross the street and say, "What a kind, good young man." Or consider any war. A man serves his country willingly or not and dies there. When his body is returned to his family in a zinc coffin, the government declares, "Your son, father, husband, he was a hero, a true patriot, a truly good man." So in this case, the state has received a service, the ultimate sacrifice in the form of the soldier's life, and then the state repays it by bestowing the title of good. And all of us remember the biblical example as well, where God gives Adam the authority to name all creatures, granting him dominion and authority over them, as well as his partnership with God in tending to the world. So this approach implies that those who receive this service are somehow have the right to name things, have the power to name things. Nietzsche vehemently disagrees with this approach. The ability to name things, he believes, is a profound form of power, and it does not belong to the weak. It belongs to the strong, to the rulers of the world. Nietzsche says, let's look at the origins and etymology of the words good and kind, and he challenges us to examine who first called themselves good and why. He forces us to question not only the content of moral claims, but also who gets to define them. For Nietzsche, the term good has its roots in words that signified strength, nobility, and beauty. His quintessential example is the Greek ideal Kalos Kai Agathos, literally beautiful and good. And the problem, he explains, is that the word kalos simultaneously means beautiful, noble, and good. So this overlap reveals that in its origins, goodness was not about moral virtue in the Christian sense, but was tied to aesthetic and social ideals, strength, beauty, and nobility. And Nietzsche asks, who were the people who first called themselves kalos, or beautiful, good? Obviously, they were the victors, the rulers, the ones at the top, those who emerged victorious in conflicts. And initially on the battlefield, later in political arenas, or even in cultural contests. Imagine a time before society as we know it. Imagine a state of perpetual struggle among people. This was a fight for resources, women, jewels, land, and anything of value. And in this pre-societal, prehistoric struggle, there were naturally winners and losers. And Nietzsche calls the winners of this power struggle victors or masters, and the losers, the defeated, slaves. So in this prehistoric state, the struggle was primarily physical. Therefore, the victors were quite literally the strong. They were physically robust and physically healthy. Their health and strength often made them physically attractive and considered beautiful. And they were also successful by the standards of that era, of that world. For example, imagine ancient Viking warriors. Their lives were relatively straightforward. They wake up in the morning, they eat well, because as warriors, they need to stay in top physical condition, they need to eat good. Then they raid a village. Victory is essential, so they fight, they win, they plunder the village. Afterward, they eat lunch and divide the spoils, including the women they've taken. Then they go and take the women. It's an unapologetic expression of power. And in the evening, they drink mead, ale, wine, or some other alcohol. Around the table, they start brawling between each other over trivial matters. Perhaps a poorly timed yo mama joke. Swords are drawn, fights break out, and eventually they either pass out drunk or wind up dead. So that cycle repeats endlessly. In their time and in that society, by the standards of success of that era, they are considered successful, the good ones. The Vikings' morality is less about moral virtue than about survival, reputation, and status. And these strong individuals, having defeated the weaker ones and gained power over them, began to call themselves good, kind, and beautiful, because they truly believed that they were good, thriving people. These were the people who held power and authority. Their success granted them the privilege to define standards of beauty, virtue, and excellence effectively, branding themselves as kalos. On the other side were the defeated, the weak, the sick, the crippled, the underdeveloped, who became slaves to the strong. The strong labeled themselves good because it validates their position and garners loyalty from followers. In a way, it's a self-branding move in a power-centered environment. Power is the central currency. That's why I call myself good, so you know who I am. And in a purely might-based culture, fear, intimidation, awe keep challengers at bay. By calling themselves good, powerful warriors invert any possible shame about violence. There was no shame. This fosters a culture of unbridled aggression that's internally consistent. No moral guilt, just the day-to-day expectation that if you can win, you should win. So rather than being an unbiased quality inherent in all people, the labels of good and beautiful were historically claimed by those in positions of dominance. Their victories and leadership allowed them to set the moral and aesthetic norms for society, thereby reinforcing their status and influence. And this perspective reveals that our common moral values may have been less about objective ideals and more about the power dynamics that favored the strong over the weak. Nietzsche emphasizes that in this original framework, the distinction between the good, victor, and the bad, defeated, had no moral connotation. There was no condemnation, no judgment, no ridicule. It was simply a fact. We competed, we had a fight, we entered the ring, I won, and you lost. That's just what happened. There was no humiliation, no laughter, no sense of cruelty in this designation. The victors lived as victors were meant to live, with strength, vitality, dignity, and confidence. They celebrated life. They celebrated their success. They considered themselves good because they succeeded, thrived, and embodied the qualities they valued most. So as I mentioned earlier, at first winners were simply warriors, strong people who triumphed because of their physical strength. And that's what mattered most, the physical strength. Over time, however, some warriors began to believe that their success wasn't only due to brute force. They started to see their qualities, being good, beautiful, and strong, as signs of divine favor. Why did I enter the ring and win? Not just because I'm strong, handsome, or clever, but because the gods were on my side. So this is how some of the victors start claiming priestly functions for themselves, insisting that they had a direct connection to the divine. In ancient times, aristocrats often traced their lineage back to the gods, which is how the first priests emerged. So they claimed divine right as the ultimate justification for their superiority, and this belief elevated their status from mere physical victors to metaphysical and spiritual authorities. But here arises a problem with priests. The connection to the gods start to impose severe restrictions. In many early religious traditions, priests had to avoid anything that could defile their sacred status. For example, in ancient Judaism, priests were forbidden from contact with death or blood to maintain purity during rituals. Over time, similar rules emerged in other cultures, dictating that certain foods, sometimes physical contact with the earth, in some cultures, women, having sex, participating in violence, all of that could compromise a priest's holiness. So in essence, as warriors evolved into spiritual leaders, their new role demanded a clear separation from the profane world. So priests could no longer participate in physical confrontations because they are forbidden from shedding blood. They can no longer go on war campaigns with all the warriors, their old buddies, because they cannot dirty their garments. They're priests now, so they can no longer even maintain physical strength because they're required to observe strict fasts, often celibate. So this division causes the priests to become physically weak and emaciated. And this evolution divides the original class of victors and warriors into two distinct castes, warriors and priests. Warriors continue doing what victors have always done, fighting, conquering, and asserting physical dominance. And priests, on the other hand, despite all of their limitations, Nietzsche observes, priests still possess the will to power, the desire to dominate and be superior. They still want to outdo their rivals now, the warrior caste. But they can no longer do that through physical means. So they invent something extraordinary, revenge. For warriors, there is no such thing as long-term memory or long-term revenge. When one warrior insults another at the table, the insulted party immediately draws their sword and retaliates. Justice is swift and decisive. One strikes, another defends, and the conflict is resolved on the spot. Their instinct for vengeance is immediate and direct. They fight, someone wins, someone loses, it ends there. But priests, unable to act physically, turn to a new kind of weapon. Delayed and calculated vengeance. The beginnings of priestly resentment. So this will become a cornerstone of their power over time, reshaping not only how conflicts are resolved, but also the very moral framework of society. The priests begin inventing new ways to exact revenge, spiritual forms of revenge. They begin to develop strong memories. They must remember who did what to them and for what reason. Thus, revenge for them extends over time. It becomes calculated and patient. The original victors, the warriors, are almost animal-like in Nietzsche's view. A lion kills a zebra not because it is an evil murderer, but simply because that is what a lion does. The lion doesn't blame the zebra for anything, nor does it think about what's going to happen tomorrow. It lives purely in the present without long-term memory or lingering resentment. Similarly, the warrior lives entirely in the moment. Today, I wake up, eat, fight, commit acts of violence, enjoy life, plunder, and celebrate in the evening. Tomorrow the cycle repeats. Each day is straightforward and predictable, driven by instinct and necessity. Alright, so we have two groups among the victors of life: warriors or masters and priests. The priests are rivals to the warriors and they seek allies or at least subordinates among the slaves. So now let's turn our attention to the slaves. The defeated, the beaten, the wretched, the sick, the weak, the crippled, the underdeveloped. Those who are subjugated, lacking both physical power and autonomy. Just like priests, the slaves also cannot physically resist their victors, their masters. They're trapped in their situation, unable to fight back or escape. The slaves are constantly suffering. And for us humans, suffering in itself is not the problem. Humans are capable of enduring the most unbearable suffering imaginable, as long as they see meaning behind their suffering. But when suffering has no purpose, no justification, no meaning, no higher framework to explain it, it becomes intolerable. And so the slaves face a profound existential dilemma. They cannot resist their suffering, yet they cannot make sense of it. And this dilemma lays the groundwork for a monumental shift in morality. Since the slaves are constantly suffering, they ask themselves the same question over and over again. Why? Why did I become slave and he became a master? Why did he win the battle with me and I lost? Why was he seemingly born healthy and strong while I was born sick and weak? These harrowing questions, for which they cannot find an answer for a long time, push them toward a moral judgment, a shift Nietzsche calls the slave revolt in morality. Slaves cannot accept the division proposed by the masters, good versus bad. To survive, they invent a new division, evil versus good. The master is the victor, the strong, the rich, and the master's morality begins to form as well. It begins with self-affirmation. He starts with himself, declaring himself good, and then extends this definition outward. They proclaimed, "Look at me, I am successful, I am good. All who are not like me or who fail to be like me are bad." The slave, they cannot afford to think this way. So the weak starts not with himself, but with the master. He begins with resentment and reaction. The slave takes the master's values, everything that master calls good, and labels all of that as evil. So think about it. Who is less likely to enter heaven than a camel passing through the eye of a needle? The rich. What are some of the most severe mortal sins? Lust and gluttony. So all of what masters have enjoyed, the slave takes the life lived by the master and declares all of that as evil life. The master is condemned essentially to hell for living a full and indulgent life. The slave, unable to live such a life, then proclaims, "The master defeated me, not because of chance, but because he made a moral choice to defeat me, a moral choice to be a bad person, a moral choice to have power over me. He is evil and I am good. I suffer not because of circumstances, but because I made a moral choice to be a good person." This leads to the invention of free will, which Nietzsche sees as the cornerstone of the slave's moral revolution. A lion kills a zebra. Its actions are driven by biological necessity and survival mechanism. The lion cannot contemplate whether it should or should not kill the zebra. They act according to their nature. For the lion, killing a zebra is not a moral action, but an instinctual one, a means to obtain food and sustain its life and a life of his cubs and his pride. So the lion does not have a choice in the human sense. And precisely because of this, the lion cannot be considered evil. To declare the lion evil, one must assert that the lion has a choice to kill or not to kill. So the slaves declare their condition to be the result of their own choice, and the condition of the masters to be the result of the master's choice. In this way, to the slaves, their suffering gains meaning. I am downtrodden, pitiful, weak, and wretched, not because I lost the race of life, because I lost the fight with the warriors, but because I choose to be a good person. I choose to be good and my enemies choose to be evil. But the slaves cannot enact such a moral revolution on their own. They are aided by the former masters, the caste of priests, who possesses a deeper understanding of these concepts. And Nietzsche points out two key aspects of this shift in morality. Number one, revenge. The slaves seek vengeance against their masters, though not directly, as they're incapable of direct revenge. And number two, reactivity. The new morality of the good is purely reactive, not proactive. The new morality built by the slaves is defined entirely in opposition to the master's values. It does not create new values, it reacts to the values imposed by the masters. Look at any superhero movie. A superhero does nothing until provoked. They act only in response to a villain's actions. When, let's say, a bank is robbed, when innocents are harmed, when a building catches fire, the superhero is reactive, not proactive. They do not create, they merely respond to threats. Nietzsche argues that reactivity suffocates creativity because it reduces individuals to responding to someone else's creation rather than producing something original of their own. True humanity lies in the proactive, creative assertion of one's own values and will, rather than in reactive submission to the values of others. And if we think again about the masters and the slaves, the masters create their life, while the slaves only react to life. Originally, the Jews were among the quintessential slaves, a status shaped by their defeats at the hands of Assyria, Babylon, and especially Rome. Under Roman rule, brutal suppression of revolts made the Roman Empire one of the Jewish people's greatest enemies. And though crushed by Rome, The Jews sought vengeance against their oppressors. Again, of course, not through physical confrontation, but by undermining Roman culture and replacing it with their own. So Nietzsche describes this as the culture of resentment, the culture of revenge. To this new moral and metaphysical order, they added a supernatural dimension, introducing forces that reward and punish. The slave cannot physically punish the master for being evil, so the slave needs a supermaster, an entity above all masters who can punish the master for his wrongdoing. Naturally, this punishment does not occur during the master's lifetime, but after his death. And at the same time, this supermaster also rewards the slave for his moral choice and virtuous life, again, in the afterlife. So this invented supermaster becomes central to the slave morality, offering divine justice and compensation for earthly suffering. Nietzsche argues that this is a natural progression of morality because it domesticates humanity. The wild, primal man, the warrior, the victor, the lion cannot create a functioning society. His world is one of constant conflict and chaos. For society to exist, humans must become safe, domesticated, and incapable of causing harm to others. Slave morality, Nietzsche argues, is far better suited for this purpose than master's morality, which is why it successfully replaces the latter. The slaves, aided by the priests, carried out a revaluation of values, and we still live within it. While empires like the Roman, the Mongol, the Ottoman, the British, the Russian Empire rise and fall, the church, built on slave morality and priest's morality, remains steadfast. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Zarathustra saw many people and states. No force is greater than that of good and evil. Slave morality endures because it transforms suffering into meaning, weakness into virtue, and vengeance into divine justice, thereby reshaping human values and enabling the creation of stable societies. Here's what Zarathustra understood. Morality shapes our approach to the world and compels us to shape the world itself. Nietzsche declares that a new era is dawning, an era in which we must carry out yet another evaluation of values. However, he is not suggesting a return to the natural man, the lion man, the Viking victor who plunders, rapes, and drinks mead. Nietzsche explicitly rejects this regression. Instead, he argues that the individual or the people capable of performing this new revaluation will seize dominion over the world, just as Christianity and later Islam dominated the next 1,000 years following the slave morality revolution. Nietzsche's vision is not a return to primal savagery, but the creation of a new framework, one that transcends the current moral order, allowing humanity to move beyond its limitations and define a new path for itself. This new revaluation, he suggests, will define the next stage of human progress and the cultures that lead it. So here we stand at the crossroads Nietzsche envisioned. A world shaped by ancient struggles for power, priestly cunning, and the slave revolt in morality. Whether we realize it or not, the values we cling to today were forged in these epic historical clashes. But Nietzsche reminds us that the values are not fixed. They're up for revaluation, and it's up to us to decide what comes next. Are we content to follow the moral legacy we inherited, or will we dare to ask the hardest questions and shape a new vision for humanity? The choice is ours. The choice is yours.